Hey everybody, welcome back to the Preacher Boys podcast. My name is Eric Skwarczynski. I'm a former fundamentalist who exposes the dark side of the church from the pulpits to the pews. If this setting hasn't given it away, and the title hasn't given it away, and the thumbnail hasn't given it away, this episode is going to be about camp, particularly church camp, something that played a formative role in so many of our lives growing up in evangelicalism. And it's also the subject of Cara Meredith's new book titled Church Camp: Bad Skits, Cry Night, and How White Evangelicalism Betrayed a Generation. I want to just read this one section of her book. It's on page 57. And the reason I want to read this is because I think it sums up so much of what the deconstruction journey has been for me, and I'm sure it'll relate to so many of you as well. If anything in the next two paragraphs that I'm going to read stand out to you, head to the link in the show notes to this episode, grab a copy of Cara's book, and start reading it. Even if camp wasn't a huge part of your life growing up, even if it's something where like you had a generally positive experience, the way she talks about camp is really a just microcosm of evangelicalism in general. And so it's really well worth reading. This is what she said on page 57 that I just highlighted and highlighted and highlighted. It says, 40 years later, the life of faith doesn't feel as easy as it used to be. The name of Jesus, now layered within a journey of belief and disbelief, of running away from God and being pulled toward God in synchronous moments along the way. I suppose the Jesus of my church camp days is still there. His compassionate love, the one my inner compass points toward, his fierce justice, the guide I try to follow. But Jesus is no longer the tool I use to prove an equation correct, or the name I use to draw divided boundary lines between who's in and who's out. No longer is he the one whose name I employ for positions of place within an inner circle, or for decisions of who remains on the outside of understanding. This Jesus comes not with warnings or caveats of belonging, for he is no longer the one in whose name harm is done, for whom exclusion becomes the rule. I believe in a Jesus who does no harm. I actually opened this episode with a passage of the book that I think stands out to me as kind of like why I would recommend the book. Like, what is the thing that like I think this book is about? And so I read page 57 and 58, which I won't reread back to you, and my audience has already heard it. And just the page before that, you talk about how automatic Jesus's name is to your personhood. And, you know, I think regardless of where people are now, I know for me, there's such a intertwined nature of the faith I was raised in from the time I was literally born to go like, what is my actual default operating system without any programming on it? What do I actually feel about these things? And I feel like this book to me was very much an examination of kind of like a microcosm of that whole system in the course of a 7-day period of camp. It was really interesting to me in that regard. And I'll be honest, going into it, I was like, camp was one of the things for me that I have really fond memories of. Like for me, camp is something that was like a highlight of my year. I loved it. And I still, looking back, you know, I identify a lot of things you talk about in the book. But when I look at like things that traumatized me growing up, camp never climbs into the list for me. And so I was almost hesitant to pick up the book and go like, oh, do I want to start feeling bad about something I feel pretty good about, you know, so far? But looking at it as an examination of like a microcosm of Christianity and like all of it compressed into 7 days was really interesting. What would you say first and foremost, just to kind of set the baseline, what was your goal in terms of like the readership of this book? Like when you were picturing like who's going to pick this up, are you picturing someone like me that goes like, it seemed fine to me, maybe there was something that was not good about it? Or were you looking for the people that were like, camp was horrible, it's one of the darkest periods, or somewhere in between? Like, what was your kind of target audience you had in your mind as you were writing?
Yeah, that's a great question because I did have both of those were audiences. And so I'm trying, I mean, even as you're asking or as you ask the question, I find myself going, well, which one was it?
Right.
And I think that's where, and you probably sense this as well, but the both and, there's a theme of both and or a paradox that runs throughout the book, or at least I think some people pick up on that.
Yeah.
In that way, it was equal parts. I also had an incredible experience at camp. I mean, that's part of why I was in the camp world for so long, was because I loved it, because it was so life-giving, because it wasn't negative. And I was on the receiving end of privilege for the most part, minus being a woman. I was on the receiving end of privilege. So I think there's an audience of those who have deconstructed their faith,
Hmm.
I'm not a huge fan of the word deconstruction, even though I realize that this book could probably land in the deconstruction tome of books because it's about my own spiritual evolution or deconstruction. So I think it's for those people, which is probably also to say those who would identify within more progressive versions of Christianity. I think it is for those who have experienced harm at camp, particularly people of color, the LGBTQ community, women. And so, but it wasn't written just toward either of those audiences.
Mm.
So I realize I don't have a completely clear, I don't have a completely clear question or answer, which is also probably why the publisher was like, well, is anyone going to pick this up? Because it's about, like you identified, and you said it perfectly, it's about this microcosm of evangelicalism or white evangelicalism. But I think we can examine the microcosm and that can help us understand the whole picture. So there's also that third audience.
Yeah, it really was like, it was so interesting picking it up. And I don't remember, I think it was maybe your publicist had reached out and pitched it, or I forget how it even initially came on the radar. But it was just one of those ones where I was like, is there something I have to even talk about relating to this? Is it something that I want to open the door to? And I think the pretty immediately going through it, I was like, this really is like everything about growing up in evangelicalism condensed to 7 days. You even kind of structure your book in that format of like, what are the 7 days? But I think the next level of that is like, I realized reading it, like the reason that camp didn't seem that crazy to me is that I had already done the conversion part in my day to day. So like, we just had fun stuff added to like the typical things that we were already hearing. So that stuff didn't stand out to me as much attending camp. For someone who's listening to this, who's wondering like, what's your approach to this? You mentioned you were working at camp for a long time. How long did you work at these camps, and how many different camps did you work at? Was it the same camp? Were you spread out? Like, how much of an experience in this world did you have? And spoiler alert, a lot. But for someone listening, what was kind of your circles that you were in the camp world?
So I oftentimes say I went to camp for the first time as a camper. This is not a staff person, but as a camper in 1988 as a 9-year-old. So you can do the math and figure out how old I am. And then I just stayed for another 30 years. I was never on full-time staff, like year-round staff at a camp. I was always either a seasonal staff worker or seasonal staff employee, which is how the American Camping Association would classify it or call it, or I was a contract employee. I was a camp speaker. So I was a camper, for probably the first 7 years of my life. I think it was 1996. That was the first time I was a staff person. So I was a volunteer. I worked in the kitchen. I was a lifeguard. I was a ropes course instructor. I was a camp counselor. I was on program staff. I was in charge of leaders. And then when I graduated from college, I became a teacher. I was a high school English teacher for a handful of years, and I needed to keep paying rent during the summer. So I became a camp speaker. So that was how I filled my summers. I was still in the evangelical world, but I was very much in more of a progressive side of the evangelical world that allowed women to speak. So I started speaking at camps, and really that was what I did. I mean, now I have to think about the math, but the last time I ever spoke at a youth camp was 2014, and then a family camp was 2018.
Yeah.
So I was in that environment, and as far as the number of camps, it initially started out just at either Young Life camps or there was one covenant camp that I worked at for a handful of summers. But once I started speaking, that's where I began speaking at a number of different camps in a number of different denominations or organizations, and literally speaking to thousands of children every summer and every year.
It's a really unique experience because you're getting to see so many different facilities and organizations and how they operate. And you had shared a review from Christianity Today kind of critiquing your book and talking about how you've done a certain amount of interviews. I think you interviewed 50 for your book. You talk about different experiences, but their argument really leaned heavily on, well, this doesn't count for all of them. You haven't been to all of them, but you've been to a large swath of camps from a variety of stripes. Some that you've mentioned were far more progressive, some that were far more conservative. What would you say were consistent positives that you saw across these camps where you go like, This is what I think is beautiful about church camp. And what were the consistent, maybe negative threads you saw represented pretty equally around the camps that you visited over your career?
The CT article to me was just, I mean, it was just kind of silly. I mean, I think that in all honesty, it's kind of backfired and it's gotten a lot of attention on the book, which is not what they were intending.
Yeah.
But part of why I did all of those interviews was because I knew that my experience was largely centralized on the West Coast. There were some camps that were a little more in the Midwest, but it was largely on the West Coast. So I then sought to find interviewees and interview folks across the country. So hence I interviewed a lot of people in the South and in the Northeast and also in the Midwest and also on the West Coast. But I wanted to get interviewees. I wanted to get interviews from people across denominational spectrums who had all experienced camp. So that's where we see within this book there's a representation of Pentecostals and SBCers and non-denomination. I'm like, do I put in non-denominationalers? That's not really a word, but it kind of sounds like what I should do right here. But across the theological spectrum within or of evangelicalism. So as far as the positives, because that was actually one of my initial questions I asked everyone. I said, what are some of your fondest memories of camp? What, is there one experience? And so we would go down this list of 15 questions. So as far as positive experiences or memories, I would say probably the top three would be nature. So people being out in nature, people who loved camp enough, who had enough experience at camp in this world, they so often they came alive in nature. Nature was a place that, I mean, and camps, like camp is in nature. Those I think who perhaps find a home in the Christian tradition would say that camp is a place where God and nature meet. And whether or not you want to believe that, it's a place that is so elevated. I think the second thing, it was just fun. Camp is fun. It's campy. It's silly. It's just no holds back. Some weird. I think that's part of why I thrived in it. And third, and I guess I could keep going down, but third, it was oftentimes a place of foundational friendships and relationships. So many people spoke to the fact that the friendships and the relationships that they established in those environments as 20-year-olds, as 25-year-olds, whatever it was, or even as campers, those friendships would stay with them, oftentimes stayed with them for the rest of their lives because there was something that happened in that condensed, unique window of time. As far as some of the negatives, I was very strategic about who I interviewed. I only wanted to interview people who had been a part of white evangelical camps. And white evangelical camps, as you know from reading the book, but also just in general, it's not like you can go to a website and they'll be waving a banner across the top or an announcement bar that says we are white evangelical. I mean, it's a little bit more about reading between the lines of belief systems and or of who holds the power and or of the denomination at large. So I wasn't necessarily interviewing folks who were part of mainline camps or who were part of non-religious camps. So I was specifically interviewing those who had an experience in white evangelical camps. And I would say, I mean, first, the thing that was universal was that there was always, if they remembered the talk progression or the theological progression that happened, it was universal to what and how I built this book. And it then oftentimes accumulated in something of a cry night or decision night, something that was about kids getting right with God, but oftentimes it was to the detriment of it involved really harmful theology. It wasn't necessarily that way across the board, but it was for a good majority of people. So that's where so many people they'd be like, there was this really bad theology. They made me feel like shit about myself. I mean, I don't know if I'm allowed to cuss on your podcast, but
No, you're 100% free to cuss. And if you weren't, it's too late. So go ahead, keep it going. I actually wrote down the first thing on my notes is a quote from your book where you said, making kids feel like shit in order to understand God's love doesn't make sense. That's literally the first note. So let it rip, because that was something that stood out to me, certainly.
yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think for a lot of the people, if they remembered the theological progression, there was oftentimes there was this memory of just feeling really bad about themselves. I title it "Dirty Rotten Little Sinners," but really it's a matter of it was oftentimes a matter of making kids feel like shit about themselves in order to understand that God loves them. Which I think you and I could obviously riff on for quite a while. So for some people, they went to very rustic camps, so they didn't necessarily experience highly programmatic or glitzy camps. So there were some experiences there that were, depending on which of the two situations, were either really positive or really negative. So I would say that's where a lot of that's where both the harm and the good took place. That was kind of universal across the board.
And that was the stuff that was kind of fun reading, is like there's like this nostalgia that happens when you're reading it, where you're like, oh, I remember going to camp. And I was thinking through, like, because we camped in Southern California in like the desert, that was like where I did the majority of my camping. So it was very Western themed. You're walking around with like, a bandana and, drinking very cold soda and getting dehydrated, walking around. And then, and then going to Michigan to camp and enjoying like something that felt so foreign to me as a Californian, like getting in the woods and enjoying it. And then going to Northern California, which is like this kind of wooded mountain setting as well. Like it is all those great memories flood back. And then you remember these progressions of like feeling immense amounts of shame or guilt about things, you mentioned in your book, like feeling shame for sex that you weren't even having at the time. You're like, someday I could be this bad and I will feel bad then, So I guess let's talk about that. I mentioned before the call, like I kind of pulled three categories that I picked up. You talk about patriarchy in the book, which you can't talk about something that is a microcosm of conservative Christianity without that coming up. You talk about purity culture, which really comes front and center, I think, in the camp setting. I know in the ones I went to. And then you talked about pressured decisions. I think we're kind of already in the realm of the pressured decisions, because that is the overarching goal of these 7 days at many camps, is to get campers to make a decision. With that in mind, before we get into that system, you were in the camp world for so long. You've been around so many camps. I don't think there was this sinister rubbing your hands together going, how do I manipulate these kids into doing this? But also there kind of is. So like, for people that are questioning the motivations of camp workers, like, how would you describe that? Like, what was your mentality going into the camp setting?
So I think the average camp employee, I think for the ones who really buy into this, maybe that's where I want to start.
Yeah.
This is where, and I write in the book again, and this is camp is a microcosm of white evangelicalism. So that's where, within this mentality, the most loving thing you can do is communicate you can communicate that God loves you. You can communicate this message of hell because you want to spend the rest of your life, you want to spend heaven. You want to spend the rest of your life. If you believe in this, you want to spend eternity with these people. So that's where the most loving thing that you can do is present this message that hopefully gets them to say yes.
Right.
So then, which I go into this in the book, which I think is part of the mindset. So in that way, when it came to presenting the message, especially when I was a camp speaker, and this is what I was doing and saying year after year, week after week, there was this end goal of conversion. I mean, which is I argue in the book, that's the whole point of most camps. I mean, the point is conversion. Even if a camp says, no, we're not about converting, we're about discipleship. The reality is that in the end, the way camps, which are privately owned and operated entities, either within denominations or without, the way they make money is oftentimes through private donors. And so within that, they have to be able to prove to their private donors and or whoever is supporting them that they are doing what they have set out to do. And so that's where at the end of the summer, you are going to have camps that are presenting a message of, oh yeah, X number of kids, 109 kids came to know Jesus for the first time this summer or rededicated their lives. A couple of SBC camps or SBCers that I interviewed, they also included missionary numbers and or campers who decided to go into full-time ministry.
Yeah.
So oftentimes there's a need for quantifiable evidence
Yeah.
that what they are doing in these environments is actually working. So that's where you take a step back and that's where the decision night happens. But when I was in it, did I think it was sinister? No, because the most loving thing I thought I could do was help bring people to Jesus,
Yeah.
to help convert them essentially. Even if I would not have used that language, I would have said, "No, I'm ushering them into relationship with Jesus." Or something like that. Like this is the best thing. Like, why wouldn't I want them to know or to hear the good news?
Yeah.
Like, you and I both came from this world. We could
Yeah.
probably both it's not religion, it's relationship. Like,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Even things like that. Like I sometimes wrestle with, I feel like it's a constant rubber band between cynicism and like also remembering that like, my motivations a lot of times were not negative, or there were positive benefits. So like you waffle between being apologetic for the environment you grew up in, but also on the flip side, being very critical. And it's a weird balancing act because I do look at so many people and I look at myself and I go, well, you really did want kids who were dealing with really tough stuff to have a place that felt safe, to get away from their home, get away from their school and go to this place to connect with God and get in nature and do all these things. And I would argue there's still benefit to all of those things. You know, but on the flip side, I think what you address is that like I think almost anybody, like I'm not religious now, I would still say like going and meeting God in nature is a really cool thing. And I don't even know what that really means for me at this point, but it is a cool thing and I still enjoy doing that. But I think when we talk about like conversion, specifically in relation to white evangelical camps, you hit on page 20 that conversion into white evangelicalism means buying into what Kristen Dumais says is the myth of rugged individualism, family values, traditional gender roles, and a response to the cultural uprisings linked in communism, women's liberation, and the civil rights movement. And the key part here is that you add is even if this understanding is never stated from the front of the room or isn't realized for another 20 years, if ever. So not only are you accepting like a relationship with God, you're accepting many times a pathway into ministry in a certain denomination with a certain college, getting married to a certain type of person, working at a certain type of church. Like all of a sudden, this escape from all the systems, this reconnection with nature becomes a funnel into a much more rigid system and a much more rigid process that isn't unique, that doesn't have that individualistic kind of thing that like you almost go to camp to like discover yourself. And then they kind of go like, no, we're actually going to tear you down and rebuild you into X, Y, and Z. And I think that's like the part that goes like, oh, that feels a little bit off. That feels a little bit wrong. And these cry nights, I know that they exist. I know that this was a pattern in VBS and camp and revival services where you're so mentally, emotionally, physically exhausted that like, okay, that one last sermon on hell and how bad you are for doing X, Y, and Z is the perfect introduction to, okay, now go home and start living this way.
And it's fascinating to me also that it is accepted rhetoric. So I mean, it's accepted, but it's also accepted and expected rhetoric. And so I think about, I talk about this in the end, the very last chapter, the very last main chapter, chapter 7, is about the harm, particularly toward people of color. And one of the young men that I interviewed, he had experience both in the evangelical world and then later within the Episcopal tradition. And for him, he identifies as Black, he identifies as bisexual. For him, the invitation into evangelicalism really was an invitation into conformity. And it was an invitation into conformity at the expense of his racial identity. But also of a myriad of other identities and parts of who he was. So as he began to grow in accepting who he was as a Black man, he began to see how the norms of whiteness had been part of what he was expected to do. He was expected to give up his Blackness to the detriment of whiteness. So I bring that up also just because that's part of what's happening.
Yeah.
So then you have these nights that are, again, universal across the board. One of the articles I've been writing and toying with right now is, well, what is the role of ritual? What is the role of ritual, particularly for young people, when oftentimes they need it? They need something to mark their experience.
Yeah.
But I think for camps, and perhaps also, like you said, for VBS, because VBS and camps, a lot of times they're regurgitating the same message. But at what point do we go too far? I have two kids. I have a 10 and a 12-year-old. If they were sitting right here, they would say they are almost 11 and 13. And my 12-year-old especially, he has been coming into his humor this year. I think he's super funny, but I also know when he's being funny and when he's not. And so there is this conversation that we repeatedly have when we're driving to school or going to the gym or whatever. He'll be trying out his jokes, and I'll just be like, all right, Cannon, you just crossed the line. You crossed the line. Like, you were right here. You're, all of a sudden you just went a little too far. And so you crossed the line. So at what point are we also doing that with camps? That we're saying, yes, there is something magical that happens when humans get out in nature, whether or not we call that God, who also is in that. But at what point do the tactics toward conversion, toward that end result, whatever it is, at what point do we cross the line?
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of what I examine and what I'm critical toward. And a lot of what those who are still in the system, who still identify as evangelical, are sitting here going, no, there's not anything wrong with that.
Yeah, so there's validity, I think, on all sides of that. Like, there's, and it is like it's such a thing that you have to check yourself as a content creator. If we want to use that word, it's always like content creator.
Good job, Eric.
Podcaster, content creator, author is like, you certainly have a perspective on this, but it's also you have to check yourself where you're going. Were they making the most of their day, or was it sleep deprivation to, were they pushing you to get out in nature, or were they, isolating you from outside information? Like, you can start going down this very like conspiracy theory approach to it. And I think you do a good job kind of balancing, like, okay, here's what we were trying to do. Here's what I wouldn't have thought it was at the time, but I recognize was problematic now, but there's all these layers to it that are like so interesting to unpack. When it comes to the pressured decisions specifically, like we mentioned, obviously, like the salvation conversion is like the number one, but there's also layers and layers of other things that just feel very random. And that can be getting rid of music, which a lot of these things can be identity things too. Getting rid of music, getting rid of movies. I've been the variety of things you've heard people like felt shame over or gave up on a cry night.
I think you're the first person to ever ask me that question. A lot of it had to do with behavior. I mean, I remember after one summer at camp, just being like, I gotta get rid of my secular CDs, and just like being so sad about having to give up TLC's Don't Go Chasing Waterfalls. I was like, it's just such good music. But I was like, it's of the devil. So, I mean, so that's not a behavior, but I remember talking to a couple of men who, like, as a result of camp, like, they formed these anti, like, masturbation groups. And so they were like, we're giving up that which we need to not do because we need to not sin, and we need to keep our sisters in Christ, like, keep it positive. So there was literally, like, they didn't call it the anti-masturbation group, but it was like this, we're setting our eyes on Jesus. There were so many queer identifying folks that, as a result of camp, I mean, and this one is not as funny. I mean, I think the previous one is kind of funny, but there were so many LGBTQ identifying folks that camp and their experience, even if it was never said from the front of the stage, they knew the expectation. They knew the understanding around what was accepted and unaccepted behavior. And so they gave up, their sexual or their gender identities. So they repressed their sexuality as a result of camp.
Yeah, right. And when you're talking about the previous humorous kind of version of this, We just finished watching through One Tree Hill, and when they had because I interviewed Bethany Joy Lenz on the show a while back, and they had a whole season where like the kids started this group in school called the Clean Teens, and I was like, this feels way too close to home. This random show having this whole layout, I was like, this feels very familiar.
Clean Teens, I called this emergency meeting because there is an imposter among us. One of you has soiled the Clean Teen name. And I think we all know who that person is.
Fun reference for One Tree Hill viewers. But yeah, the conformative identity, and I think that goes perfectly into the other P in my list. Purity culture. For everyone listening, former Baptist, I alliterated the list of 3 takeaways. But gender and sexuality is a huge, like, both unspoken and spoken thing, at least in all the camps I attended. First of all, you're getting a bunch of generally teenagers at a campground where you're going to be thinking about sex because you're a teenager on a campground with a bunch of people of the opposite sex. But almost every camp, I don't know if this is true for you, every camp that I went to was day 1, rule number 1, girls are pink, boys are blue, don't make purple. That was like the number 1 first rule that they told us. Many people broke that rule at camp. But beyond that, you know, as like, I think a lot of times it was unspoken, but I know in the camps that I went to, some it's not the case. But I mean, anything outside of heteronormative relationships was not okay, to the point where it was kind of a given, I think, at most of the camps that I was attending. Like, you wouldn't even be coming with your church if you thought that was even an option. Yeah. But on top of that, there was a lot said about heterosexual relationships. It was like, don't be this. Only focus on girls, but also do not focus on girls or do not focus on guys if you're a girl in the camp in this way, in this way, in this way. And I would say the number 1 sermon topic was always, you know, not kissing before you get married, don't hold hands before you get married, don't do this, like this long list of things. Researching all of these camps, like what role did purity culture play? And why do you think that was like, you know, purity culture and I would say sexuality in general, because we can talk about kind of the LGBTQ audience in that as well. Why do you think that was such a big focus at some of these camps? Because it almost feels like it was neck and neck with like the gospel. It's like, don't have sex before you get married and also don't go to hell. And like those things are pretty neck and neck for your attention this week. Like, why do you think that is?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of different answers to that. I would say, though, for starters, the purity culture movement, so the purity movement itself started in the mid-90s. And Linda K. Klein, her book Pure is just phenomenal. I mean, it's, you know, about this whole thing. But all of the sudden, that which birthed in the greater evangelical ethosphere found a home in camps. Like it naturally came into being. Part of it, one of the chapters that I lay out that really goes into the patriarchy, but then into purity culture, if you're already preaching a message that is largely patriarchal, that centers on God the Father, on Jesus as the Son, but really entirely on male language and male understanding of who God is, and that becomes the picture of God, then that naturally also progresses into who God most prefers. It just further elevates patriarchy, which then just breeds room and ground for purity culture. So I don't know if that's really providing an answer, but it just found a home there. So anecdotally, I really wanted Making Purple to be in the subtitle. We kept going back and forth, though. So Bad Skits, Cry Night, and How White Evangelicalism Betrayed a Generation. We wanted a little bit of the both and of both humor and, and the serious. Yeah. So it was between either Bad Skits or Making Purple, and the publisher felt like more people would understand Bad Skits than they would the nuance of Making Purple. But when it comes to this, you have purity culture, and I think that it naturally finds a home because of the language and the viewpoint of what evangelicals believe about who God is and how values of purity culture fit into that.
I think camp is interesting because you have like a broad group of kids. Like you have the super sheltered kids. You've got the kids who, are being sent to like made to conform back into whatever the system is, like that are like the troublemaker kid that gets sent. Like there's a broad swath of people. And, Tia Lovings talks about this in her book. Like you're getting a lot of language and verbiage that for a sheltered kid is kind of shocking. It's like, oh, we're talking about this stuff in really wild ways. And I think like this is a piece that I kind of want to circle around is like, you're hearing rhetoric for the first time about things that you're hearing about for the first time when you've also been told, like, do not think about this stuff. Do not focus on this. Like Tia Loving talks in her book, like we weren't allowed to go to Blockbuster, but my youth pastor was talking about orgies and, all of these things that were like very extreme. Do you think it's just because camp is so heightened and extreme in every way that like they felt comfortable giving more extreme examples or pushing to be more like outspoken about certain topics? Why do you think there was that like heightened level of like, we're going to dig deep in these issues with these like 12 to 17-year-olds in a camp setting who otherwise don't talk about these, don't have sex education, don't talk about these topics whatsoever? Like, what do you think the reason was for that heightened kind of focus on this topic?
I think part of it was what camps deemed kids or campers most wanted to hear.
That's an interesting statement.
I mean,
there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, and that's where you're doing some of the questions you're asking, Eric. You're asking for the first time, so I can't necessarily repeat what I've said on the previous 30 podcasts, which is a very, very good thing.
But not great at podcast 31, where you're like, it would be nice to repeat a couple of those and not have to think of a new one,
No, I appreciate you. I think this is a great conversation. So I think about, and again, I was on staff at camps a long time ago, but we would make jokes about it, but we would say, all right, well, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And really, we were quoting our parents' generation. Like,
yeah.
All right. So I think that there was this understanding of, well, this is what kids are really dealing with. So I think just even the sex, drugs, rock and roll, like the reality of what children were really dealing with. So then you had just this understanding that, well, yeah, they really were dealing with maybe youth. They really were dealing with sex. They were dealing with the pressure of that. And so we wanted to address it head on. I think a lot of it, though, when it comes to purity culture, again, I think that there's this natural filtering that happens where you have the patriarchy and then you have this filter into really complementarianism, the role of men and women. And so when you have male headship and female submission, then you have the expectations that have to be broken down even more from that. Bradley Onishi, author of Preparing for War, Straight White American Jesus podcast host, he would say that it's funneling toward an expectation or a norm of what they want children to become within Christian nationalism, like within the values there. So I guess I'm still circling a bit and figuring out the answer with you.
Let's keep figuring it out. I mean, this is one of the things that you mentioned that just stood out to me, and like,
yeah,
I think we could spend forever on is you said it's what the kids wanted to hear. And I think that is a really interesting piece of the puzzle where, I would say like on the extreme side of this, in the stories that I'm covering, a lot of times when I'm talking about grooming, the conversation with leadership is like they talk about things that you're not really supposed to talk about, and they do it in a way that you can't point to and say like, that's inappropriate, because they are talking about it in like the youth pastor that tells you they like a band that maybe the church wouldn't necessarily endorse, or where they talk about sex in a really raw and unfiltered way, or they talk to you like one of the adults. Like that's like the far extreme. And I'm certainly not accusing every single leader who talks about these things of that. But on the flip side, though, in a camp setting, there is an element here of like the forbidden fruit also being the draw to pay attention, oh, he's talking about a very violent car crash that someone had. They're talking about this, we had a wild illustration about like this guy that goes to a party and is doing all these things, and they're descriptive about it in a way that is very sensational and very, I would say, like exploitative of the story. but then it has like this like shame element at the end with like a call to action. But it is really interesting. Like I think about those camp messages where like we were so locked in because they're talking about like all of these really exciting and forbidden topics. And that's interesting with the whole idea of 7 weeks, like how quickly can we get the guard down? That like they lean into those stories that maybe they're not hearing in their home church or they're not hearing from their parents.
Well, and I think, I mean, so first of all, going back to what you just said at the very beginning, I would say that it's what we thought kids wanted to hear. It wasn't necessarily, I mean, so I think also putting that clarifier there too.
Yeah.
So how much did we understand what they really, what they really wanted versus how much did we just think? But I think you have within this environment, and this is where I think it's, so again, I look at it and I oftentimes use the language of conversion that, again, as we've already talked about, the whole point was conversion, but it's also conformity into this particular way of life or belief system. And so even if that is never actually what is said, I think that's also where the grooming piece comes into play, where conversations of abuse come into play, which I know is something you examine and look at quite a bit here too. And so all of these together, how are they all together? Even if staff people, for example, don't realize that they're doing it, that and this might be the excuse that is being used, that they're just, they're just doing what's always been done, or they're just following the rules.
Yeah.
They're just doing what they're being told to do. All of it is taking away personal choice. As much as that is a value within white evangelicalism, it's taking away personal choice to the point of conformity and conformity to these particular values.
Yeah. And even going back to like what you said about like informing them about what they should want to hear about versus going, what is the need of this camper? What is the need of the, like, it's generalizing. And, while again, they know how to play up the interest, like guys in youth group love gross games, so it's like, eat this weird thing, that's going to go over well. Like, but when it comes to like, what are the struggles of each generation? It is very much like, you should be concerned about sex, drugs, rock and roll, the same way that I was when I was at camp and my parents were at camp and their parents were at camp prior. I know we're near the end here, but I do want to touch on this last piece. And I think that there is, I worked backward through my list of things, but I think ending here on patriarchy, I do think it's relevant because so much of what we talked about, from the way that the decisions are pressured to be made to the way that certainly women are impacted in the purity culture settings of camp, like there is so much of that stems from having a lack of female perspective in leadership in ministries, whether we're talking camp, church, schools, you name it. When there is only, guys leading, like you're missing the perspective of 50% of the population in your decisions. What role did you see patriarchy play in the way that camps are structured? And how do you think it could be different if more women were in leadership positions within camps like this?
I'm going to read a sentence. So again, I think, and I've said this, but it starts first, the language that we use about God and how that centers. So if God is only defined as male and or by male pronouns and understood entirely as a man, then it favors a particular subset of the human population. So I have a sentence, page 42. At church camp, we made it easier for men to succeed than women. A man wasn't questioned about whether or not he could speak at camp. He wasn't told there were certain roles for which he lacked qualifications. Instead, his penis single-handedly qualified him for anything he wanted to do. But try to hand a woman a microphone and her qualifications, her desire, and her entire identity will be questioned. Not only because this goes against the norm of who an audience expects to see, but also because it defies expectations of who a woman is expected to be at camp. So I realize I just said one sentence and then I read three. But what would it look like to defy patriarchal values, which is to say the patriarchy, and put more women in charge? Well, I think there would be, not only would there be within this context a much different understanding of God and or of spirituality, but we would be honoring the personhood of humanity.
Yeah.
We would be honoring the experiences of men and women. And this is something that the church has done a lousy job at. It's one of those that still, I've had so many women over the last couple of months who are in that world, who are still in the white evangelical world, who are still experiencing that which I experienced 25 years ago as a first-time woman camp speaker, who are going, there are still people who come up to me and who say, I've never heard a woman, I've never seen a woman speak from the front. Yeah. So what is this saying about who we value and about the messages that we value and that we receive? So, and maybe it starts with the people on stage, but it also could start with who's in charge behind the scenes. I mean, the camp staffs are still predominantly run by men.
Yeah.
So, and by white men at that, perhaps to no surprise.
Yeah. And how much does it say that your experience 20 years ago or my experience, and now 10-ish years ago is still so relevant, because I that's the other thing too, is sometimes I sit down to write something or I sit down to record something. I go, am I out of touch? Like, has it been too long? And then I start reading people's stories from now and I'm like, it's the same. And then you start reading a Kristen Dumais book and you're like, oh, it's been the same for like a century, like there's plenty to talk about. This is so funny. And this is like the cool thing between the synergy of someone reading and someone writing. In my notes, page 42, men at camp, I had it dog-eared to mention on the podcast. So I'm so glad you mentioned that section. This idea that, the only qualification you need was to be a guy. And I'll just kind of add this. I know we're here at the end, but one of the things that's really changed in my mind over the last year is like, I've been doing this show for 5 years and I've talked about like it's not good when one type of person always has the microphone. Like I always talk about, whenever I'm a guest on podcasts, like I always say some variation of like, it's time to pass the mic. Like these types of dudes have had the mic forever. Let's give the mic to people that have never had it. Like, let's give it to victims of abuse. Let's give it to women. Let's give it to minorities. Like, let's pass on the platform to people who have a perspective that has not been heard. And, even as someone saying that, for me, it was always the most elementary understanding of like, well, if women are being disproportionately abused in the church, they should probably share their experience instead of us just guessing about it. But there's layers beyond that. I was talking to Hillary McBride on the show a couple months ago, and like, I don't think people realize how rich the perspective of other people is. I think sometimes we have this binary like, well, they'll just understand the girl side of this, or they'll just understand the guy side of this. But even the way that information's interpreted is so different. And I think that's the thing that like we can fall into is like, we almost can have the pride, and I'll speak for the guys, we can almost have the pride to like think we know what women would say if they were in the position. Like we almost think we can put on like our female thinking cap and go, well, they're probably going to notice these issues and address them. And some of that's true and important. But like talking to Hillary McBride, she called out something I said on the podcast, because I said, I was talking about healing and I was talking about this progression of time. And she's like, you have a very masculine view of time. She's like, you're looking at things and going, I'll do this, and then I'll do this, and then I'll do this. She said, a female perspective of time is cycles. It's circling back through these things and re-examining them with new information. And just hearing that, I was like, wow, like that's a perspective that if I sat down with a bunch of other guys and we worked at this for years, we would make no progress. But bringing in that one piece of insight from someone who's, I mean, all gender aside, is way smarter and intelligent than most people I've ever talked to, but also has this perspective that is informed through gender, that is informed through experience, that goes like, no, you're not even like looking at the right problem. Like you're not even solving for the right thing. Like that is so valuable. And I think like reading your book, it's like so obvious, like from the purity culture side, from the decisions, from the way that women are treated in camps, from the ways that, emotions are dealt with men in these camps. Like having that other perspective could be a game changer. And it's so frustrating that 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, however many years you want to say have passed since this has started. like you're still not getting the impact of those voices that are so valuable. That's not a question, but it's just something that is just something I think about more and more is like, we don't even know what we're missing. Like we've never seen it in action. Like what would that look like?
Well, and I think to that, I would say that it's not only getting the perspective, but it's believing the perspective and it's
Yeah.
trusting the perspective.
Not just having the
So one of
token
the things,
perspective. Yeah.
not, yeah. And one of the things I thought was so interesting about like just going back to that CT article, there was a
Why not?
huge, one of the stinks she made was that I didn't back up the experiences of people who shared their experiences. And in particular, when it came to the stories of LGBTQ identifying folks, she said, well, you said they experienced harm, but you didn't actually follow up with those camps to see if it was true. And I just was like, are you effing kidding me?
Yeah.
Like, we get to believe the stories of those who have experienced harm. We get to believe the stories of women who have been subjected to purity culture and felt the effects of that 20, 30, 40 years later. We get to believe the stories of people of color who were made to deny their ethnicity, their culture, and their race, all to conform to values of whiteness.
Right.
We get to believe the stories of those whose experiences are different from our own and to trust those stories. And so, yes, those stories, those experiences, whatever we want to say, of course, that should be elevated. That is how we become more human in our understanding of one another.
And white evangelicals historically, and as a former evangelical, I can say this with confidence, is that the number one way that we have historically defended the impact of our actions is by hiding behind our intent. Like it has always been, we didn't intend to hurt somebody. I didn't intend to be racist. I didn't intend to be misogynistic. I didn't intend to suppress somebody. I didn't intend to victim shame. But you can't neglect the fact that like I had a deeply negative impact on somebody. And again, the only way you're going to know that is by hearing those stories. Like the reality is like I'm coming at it from a place of privilege to go like camp was pretty cool to me. I enjoyed camp.
Yeah.
But you know, I mean, a perfect example that's not to segue too hard is like my best friend growing up came out as gay, like I think 2-3 years ago. And we had kind of just life separated us and then we kind of reconnected and he shared that with me. But I immediately went, oh my God. Like I immediately went back through our childhood and just thought, I immediately went to me and went like, oh man, did I ever make jokes with him while he was feeling like, did I ever in that environment say things that like harmed that relation? Like, and just beyond that, like his experience and interaction with camp, with church, with school was drastically different than mine. And it's not that mine was bad and I didn't realize it, although there was some of that. It's like, it was good for me because I kind of fit the mold. And it was really bad for people it wasn't built for. And so, like, it's just, again, circling back over that stuff and getting that added voice is like, you know what? Maybe they totally intended this to be a very great getaway and reconnect with God and nature, but what did it actually do? And the kids who are sitting there going, I felt so much shame that was disproportionate to what I was actually doing in my life as a kid who never drank and never partied and never did any of the things they were even talking about. Like, how did that actually land for people? And I think, you know, to stop me from talking more and more, like, I think that's what this is to me. Like that, it's literally like, how do you reexamine the impact, the effect, and also not have to just go like, I felt good about things and now I feel bad about them. It's like, what was the good? What can be reclaimed from this that's positive? And what's the stuff that just wasn't necessary that caused a lot of unnecessary harm?
Yeah. And how do we move forward from that?
Right.
And how do we do better? A couple of weeks ago, probably a month ago, this guy reached out to me. He was the last camp director of the last youth camp I spoke at. And he had read the book and he had gotten in touch through another friend. And so long story short, we line up lunch together. And he drives up to my house. I live in Oakland, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. So he drives up to my house. I make him lunch. We're sitting in the backyard. The birds are there and the bees are flitting around in my little urban of an oasis of a backyard. And we sit down, and the first question he asks, he pulls out his phone, and he literally has this note he just starts scrolling. I mean,
And you're nervous.
I already wrote the book. The book already came out. He already purchased it. I'm fine. No, but he just said, did I contribute to harm?
Wow.
And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, I started to give an answer in my mind. I'm kind of going, well, yeah, but also I think that's for you to unpack. And he said, it's really hard for me to realize that. And he is a white man. He's a privileged white man. And he is a privileged white man with an incredible heart who feels called to camping ministries. And he is no longer at that place that he was at, that I preached at or spoke at. But he said, I didn't say a whole lot. I just mostly ate my curry. And he finally goes, I think I did, but it's just hard to wrap my mind around.
No.
And so that was our conversation for the next 2 hours as he went through all these bullet points throughout the book. But it was also him grappling with it, but it was then him thinking about, okay, now I'm at a new camp. And so how can I do better?
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a big piece, is like, and I have so much empathy, because it is rare for people to even ask the question, did I contribute to harm? Like, because that's like a big, scary question to ask.
Yeah.
But I have so much empathy for people who were well-intentioned, who go, did I waste 20 years of my life doing this wrong? Or did I? And I think there is, but I don't think it's that. I think it's literally, yeah, you did a lot of really good stuff. These are the things that weren't. What do you do differently now that you're where you're at? And that's kind of the process, is like, but asking that question is so huge. And I think that's honestly really cool to verbalize that and go like, did I contribute harm? Like, asking that is such a cool big step. And I appreciate you giving so much time. I know we're a little over, and I know you are at the tail end of a massive leg of a book tour for this book. So thank you so much for taking my questions and for taking the time to do this. Do you have any final words for someone who's going, is church camp for me? The book, not the location. Is the book church camp for me? What's your 20-second or 30-second elevator pitch for them to go grab the book?
I think church camp is for you. I hope readers, regardless of whether they even ever went to church camp, regardless of whether they had a good or bad experience at church camp if they went, I hope that, like you, they will discover and perhaps learn something about this microcosm of white evangelicalism, that I think we can very much look and see who is in charge, the decisions that are being made in our current administration, and the connections to white evangelicals. And we will probably connect the dots a little bit more as a result.
Well, thank you so much again for doing this. I hope it's not the last time we talk. I'd love to have you back on sometime and dive deeper into some of these individual topics. But I really appreciate your work and for this conversation. And thanks so much.
We are officially friends. We're friends forever now, Eric. So
Camp
I'm going to send you, I'm going to send you Michael W. Smith's song in the mail, and then we're in. I look forward to chatting again. Yeah.